If a single favor could tilt the course of your life, would you take it or pretend you never saw the sign? Mara Keller asked herself that as her dashboard flared, the engine coughed, and silence settled around the car like a held breath. No bars on her phone, no traffic, just a thin wind and the soft tick of cooling metal. She stepped out in white sneakers that didn't deserve gravel, tugged her coat tighter, and listened to the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own pulse. Headlights brushed the road far off and then vanished. She tasted the old, familiar tang of control slipping something she had spent years outrunning behind glass walls, polished tables, and signatures that moved markets. A small neon sign flickered ahead, the only uncomplicated word in sight: open. She walked toward it because walking felt like choosing, and choosing was how she'd become the person everyone mistook for unbreakable. The first rescue that arrived wasn't rescue at all. A tow truck rattled up with a grin behind the windshield that did not reach the eyes. "Lucky night," the driver said, hopping down and naming a price that insulted arithmetic. "Cash only, no receipts, lots of shrugs." Mara let him talk while her mind ran contingencies, contracts, counters, loopholes, none of which worked on a roadside with the wrong kind of smile. Then another set of lights slid in, lower and steadier. A second truck parked with the careful ease of someone who respected weight and momentum. The man who climbed out wore the day on his clothes and the week on his face, and when he looked at Mara, he didn't inventory her watch, shoes, or hesitation. He looked at the car. "Fuel starvation," he said after a listen that seemed too short to count, like a magician counting cards. "Likely the pump. You don't need a tow to nowhere. You need a part and an honest hour." The first driver spat a warning wrapped as advice and left in a wash of exhaust. The new man, Daniel Weber, according to the flaking paint on his door, glanced at Mara once more. "You riding with me or the night?" She climbed in without asking what the fare would be. He didn't ask her last name, and that felt like a luxury she hadn't afforded herself in years. His cab smelled like coffee and clean tools. On the floorboard lay a paper crown from a school fair and a single pink sneaker charm tangled in twine. "You have a co-pilot," Mara said, nodding at the crown. "I have a boss," he corrected, a small smile interrupting the tired. "Lena, 10. She's a menace to bedtimes and the reason I keep going." He drove without commentary, the kind of silence that invited truth instead of demanding it. "If it's the pump, I can get you moving tomorrow," he said. "If it's not the pump, I'll admit it, fix what it is, and pretend I said that first." She laughed for real at the plainness, at the way competence didn't need decorations. In the shop, the lights hummed awake. He slid under the car with a lamp in his teeth and a socket in his hand. The office was a museum of ordinary care. A corkboard crowded with crayon storms and stick figure medals, invoices squared into piles, a photo of a girl grinning around a missing tooth. The bell chimed, and the girl herself arrived in a blur of backpack and opinions. "You forgot your lunch," Lena announced, producing a foil-wrapped half sandwich like evidence in a trial. "You ate my lunch," Daniel said, rolling out with a smear of oil like war paint. "Because you made it," she argued, as if that were the whole point of lunches. Lena turned to Mara with grave curiosity. "Are you lost, traveling, or running away?" "Yes," Mara said, before she could practice a safer truth, and something in Daniel's expression changed as if a lock somewhere inside had heard the right key. The pump was the pump. The supplier promised a morning delivery with the kind of optimism that implies a shrug if it doesn't happen. "Guest house 2 streets over," Daniel said, wiping his hands. "Good kettle. Sheets that smell like sun. Nobody asks for your firstborn or your email." Mara nodded, more relieved than she wanted to show. Lena bounced on her toes. "There's a festival tomorrow," she said. "Lights in the trees. Dad never goes, but you should make him." Daniel's mouth did the small hard line people use to keep history from spilling. His phone buzzed then, and Mara watched posture replace fatigue. He didn't show the screen, but it didn't matter. She recognized the way a person absorbs bad news they'd planned to ignore. He looked at the office window, then back to her. "Do you have a reason someone might follow you?" he asked in a voice that had learned not to alarm children. Mara opened her mouth to lie and found herself out of practice. "If someone cares very much about where I sign my name," she said carefully, "then yes." Headlights washed the glass. Too slow, too curious, the beams scouring the room as if light could pry. A silhouette leaned on patience outside, the kind of stance expensive shoes learn in boardrooms. The door handle tested its limits. Daniel flipped the deadbolt with a soft click that sounded louder for being reasonable. "We're closed," he called, calm in a way that made calm feel like a shield. Knuckles tapped the pane, friendly as weather. "Mara," a voice said, warm and correct. "Open the door." It was the voice she used to answer even when it came from across a long table. The one that said, "Therefore," as previously discussed, as you well know. It had the particular timbre of a person who thinks your time is theirs because you once gave it freely and forgot to ask it back. Lena pressed close to Mara's side without fear, only loyalty. Daniel stayed where he was, a human hinge between them and the night. "You don't have to," he said, eyes on the shape outside. "I'm not," she answered, surprised at how steady her tone sounded inside her mouth. The voice went softer, more dangerous. "This isn't adversarial. There's just a document. Small. Clean. Everyone wins if you sign tonight." The word "everyone" landed like a splinter. Once upon a time, she'd have adjusted her spine and phrasing to make that true. Now she recognized the cheapness of a promise that included everyone and meant no one. "Come back in daylight," Daniel suggested, polite enough to be an insult. Silence stretched thin. Tires ground gravel. An engine retreated in stages, as if unwilling to surrender. They waited until the dark rebuilt itself into ordinary dark, until their breathing lined up with sensible things again. When the quiet no longer felt like a trick, Daniel lowered his hand from the lock. "Guest house can wait," he said. "If he's circling, I'd rather he circles us than find you alone." They turned the office into a fort built from practicalities. A camping cot unfolded with the brisk grace of long practice. An old quilt that remembered a different winter took the chill out of the corners. Lena produced a chipped mug and made hot water appear like a magician on a budget. "The door learns names," she told Mara with triumph, then planted herself on another chair and promptly fell asleep mid-sentence. Mara kept her boots within reach and her jacket on. Daniel sat in the doorway where the office met the shop, body angled so he could see both the front and the back. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply good engineering of risk. The hours unspooled into small pieces. Mara slept between them, waking at every change in the building's breathing. When the next sound came, it didn't announce itself with a knock or a speech. Rubber whispered over gravel. A heavier engine idled just beyond the door, unflashy and sure. Daniel's head tipped, listening like a person who knew the difference between trouble and help by the sound of a motor. He thumbed the remote. The roller door rattled up just enough to admit a pair of boots and 2 thermoses. "Neighborhood watch," said Frank Older, broad-shouldered, wearing a reflective vest like a flag of truce. "We saw a car loitering that didn't belong to the weather. Figured company beats worry." Behind him, 2 more volunteers nodded in that way communities do when they decide someone counts. They didn't ask Mara for a story. They arranged chairs, poured coffee, and sat. If the door wanted to learn another name tonight, it was going to learn all of theirs the hard way. The night finally gave way to a tired gray dawn, the kind that seeps in slowly, as though even the sun is reluctant to begin. Mara stretched her sore shoulders, realizing she had dozed in fragments on the cot. The office smelled of burnt coffee and damp fabric, while the low murmur of men's voices drifted from the garage bay, where Daniel and the volunteers still sat with thermoses in hand. Lena stirred beside her, eyes blinking awake, hair wild, and smiled as if strangers sleeping in her father's office was the most natural thing in the world. Mara envied that innocence, envied the way trust could still be simple. She rose, tugging her jacket tighter, and felt the weight of the previous night pressing in. Someone had found her, called her name through the glass. The old life she thought she'd left behind had stretched out its hand, reminding her that freedom often comes at a cost. Daniel noticed her standing there and offered a nod, not pitying, not pressing, simply acknowledging that she was still standing. Frank, the older volunteer, slapped his knees and stood with a grunt. "We'll keep an eye out. Word travels fast, and people here don't like shadows sniffing around." He meant it. She could see it in the way he tugged on his jacket, ready to patrol streets no one paid him to protect. Mara had spent years surrounded by people who only protected their own advantage. This loyalty felt foreign and unsettling. When the men left, Daniel leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his gaze steady on her. "Do you want to tell me who he was?" he asked. The question wasn't sharp, but it landed like an anchor. Mara hesitated, pressing her lips together before admitting, "Someone who thinks they own my time. Someone who doesn't understand the meaning of no." Daniel didn't push further. Instead, he turned back to the car, wiping grease from his hands. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't get to own your night." The simplicity of the statement lodged itself in her chest in a way speeches never had. By midday, the replacement part arrived, carried in a battered box that smelled faintly of metal and dust. Daniel set to work immediately, sleeves rolled, eyes focused, while Mara found herself drifting between the garage and the street outside, scanning every passing vehicle for that too-slow crawl. She hated the feeling it wasn't in her nature to watch, to wait. She was a woman of action, of decisions. Yet here she was, standing on unfamiliar gravel, listening to the laughter of a 10-year-old reading aloud while her father mended a machine, and realizing how much of her life she had spent running without rest. Daniel worked with a steady patience, and she felt her own restlessness calm just watching the rhythm of his hands. When Lena handed her a book and asked her to read a passage, Mara obeyed, her voice trembling at first, then evening out as the child nestled close. It was absurdly ordinary, and yet she felt more alive than in any boardroom she had ever commanded. When the engine finally purred back to life, the relief should have been pure. Instead, it left Mara with a knot in her stomach. Her car was ready, which meant she could leave. The option lay before her like a clean contract. Go back, return to the life that still waited with sharp edges and endless demands. But when Lena clasped her hand, eyes shining, and whispered, "You'll come to the festival tonight, won't you?" Mara couldn't answer. She looked toward Daniel, who was tightening the last bolt, his jaw set, his eyes avoiding hers as though he too was bracing for goodbye. The silence stretched until Lena filled it with hope. "Please," the girl said. "It's more fun when strangers come." Mara's throat tightened. She had been many things in her life: daughter, leader, strategist, but rarely simply a guest, welcomed with no agenda. "I'll come," she heard herself say, and Lena's grin lit the room brighter than the overhead lamp. Evening fell with lanterns strung high and music spilling into the cool air. Mara walked beside Daniel through streets that glowed with firelight and laughter, Lena skipping ahead, her joy untamed. The smell of spiced cider and roasted food mingled in the air, and everywhere they turned, people greeted Daniel with warmth and familiarity. He belonged here. She could see it in the way hands clapped his back, in the nods of respect, in the small stories exchanged about debts fixed and favors done. Mara, watching from his side, felt like she was glimpsing a life she had never allowed herself to imagine. At the center square, Lena tugged her father toward the bonfire. Music swelled, couples danced under the string lights, and laughter echoed. Mara folded her arms, watching Daniel resist, until Lena pushed his hand into Mara's. "One dance," the girl demanded, eyes daring both adults to refuse. Daniel's gaze flickered to Mara's, uncertain, and in that heartbeat, she realized how dangerous this all had become. Because the thought of leaving tomorrow was unbearable, and the thought of staying terrified her even more. The first light of morning crept into the workshop, casting long shadows over oil cans and tools. Mara stirred on the cot, stiff from half-sleep, while Daniel poured coffee in silence. The memory of the knock at the glass still clung to her, the voice that called her name with a certainty she wished she'd escaped. Lena bounced awake and smiled as if nothing were strange, making Mara wonder what it would feel like to carry trust so lightly. By noon, the replacement part arrived. Daniel worked quickly, sleeves rolled, movements steady, while Mara hovered near, torn between relief and dread. The engine came alive again, purring smoothly, and yet instead of freedom, she felt the weight of departure. Lena tugged her sleeve, eyes bright. "You'll come to the festival, won't you?" Mara opened her mouth to refuse, but found herself nodding. The child's joy felt impossible to deny. As dusk fell, lanterns glowed, and music drifted through the cool air. Daniel walked beside her, Lena skipping ahead, the town alive with warmth and laughter. Mara watched strangers greet Daniel like family, saw the way he belonged, and felt the sharp ache of envy. When Lena pressed Daniel's hand into hers and demanded a dance, Mara froze at the quiet risk in his eyes. She realized then that leaving tomorrow might be harder than she had ever imagined. The festival lights shimmered like stars caught in branches, casting soft glows over faces flushed with warmth. Mara found herself pulled into the crowd's rhythm, the music weaving around her until she forgot to keep her guard up. Daniel stood beside her, reluctant but steady, while Lena darted through groups of friends, laughter trailing behind her like sparks. For the first time in years, Mara wasn't calculating the next step or weighing the cost. She was simply there, surrounded by a life that asked nothing from her but presence. When an elderly woman pressed a warm pastry into her hand with a wink, Mara almost laughed at the absurd sweetness of it. She wasn't supposed to belong here, and yet some part of her already did. Later, near the bonfire, Daniel finally allowed himself a half-smile. "It's not the worst way to spend an evening," he admitted, the firelight painting gold along his jaw. Mara studied him, seeing the quiet strength beneath the grease and fatigue, and wondered how long he had carried so much weight alone. Before she could answer, Lena appeared with a grin, grabbing both their hands. "Dance," she ordered, eyes bright. Daniel tried to protest, but Mara squeezed his hand lightly. "You did promise," she teased. He sighed, then stepped closer, guiding her into the sway of the music. The world slowed. Around them, laughter blurred, the flames flickered, and for a moment it was only the two of them. Mara felt his hand at her back, steady and sure, and something inside her cracked open. She wasn't used to feeling safe, not like this, not in someone else's arms, not in a place that asked nothing but truth. She looked up at him, and in his eyes she saw both reluctance and possibility. The silence between them was louder than the music. When the last note faded, Daniel stepped back, clearing his throat, but the air had already shifted. Mara knew it, and so did he. As the crowd began to drift away, she caught him glancing toward the edge of the square, his shoulders tense again. She followed his gaze and felt her stomach tighten. A figure stood at the far corner, half hidden by the glow, watching without joining, his stillness too deliberate. The firelight caught a gleam of polished shoes before he turned and slipped into the dark. Mara's pulse quickened. The night's sweetness soured with the reminder that she wasn't just a visitor passing through, she was being followed. Daniel noticed the change in her face, his jaw tightening. He didn't ask in front of Lena, but his look said enough. Whoever that man was, this wasn't over. And as Mara drew a deep breath, she realized with a jolt of fear and longing that leaving tomorrow might no longer be her choice. The next morning broke quiet, but Mara's mind carried the shadow of the figure she had seen at the edge of the festival. She hadn't slept much, replaying the glimpse of polished shoes, the certainty that the past was pressing closer. In the kitchen of the small house beside the garage, she watched Lena chatter over cereal, her laughter light and unbothered, while Daniel moved around the stove with quiet efficiency. It looked like a scene she had never thought she would want: ordinary, safe, full of warmth. But the weight in her chest wouldn't lift. When Daniel finally caught her gaze, she knew he'd been waiting. "Who was he?" asked softly. She hesitated, then admitted, "Someone who doesn't like unfinished business." His jaw tightened, but he didn't press further, only said, "Then we'll deal with it when he comes back." Later, Mara wandered through the town square while Daniel finished repairs at the garage. She expected stares, maybe questions, but instead people greeted her as if she had been there for years. A baker handed her a roll still warm from the oven. A farmer offered her a pumpkin for luck. Their kindness rattled her, because she wasn't used to receiving anything without cost. For the first time, she wondered if belonging wasn't earned by power or wealth, but by showing up and being seen. Yet every smile reminded her of the danger lurking beyond the edges. How long until the man in the shadows stepped forward again? By evening, Mara returned to the garage, where Daniel was wiping grease from his hands. The car sat ready, humming like new. He gave her the news without ceremony. "It's fixed. You could leave tonight." The words landed heavy. She should have felt relief. Instead, her chest tightened with something close to dread. She looked at Lena, who was bent over a notebook, sketching fireflies with wild lines of color. The girl looked up suddenly, her eyes wide with worry. "You're not leaving, are you?" Mara swallowed hard, caught between instinct and truth. "Not tonight," she said, and Lena beamed, racing to fetch her a drawing as if to celebrate the promise. But the night didn't grant peace. As darkness settled, a low rumble of an engine passed slowly outside the garage, lingering before fading into distance. Daniel stiffened, then set down his rag with deliberate calm. He's watching the edges, he murmured. Mara's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed to run, to disappear again, but when she looked at Lena curled in her blanket, she knew she couldn't. Not this time. Daniel locked the doors and turned to Mara, his voice steady. If you want to go, I won't stop you. But if you stay, we face this together. Mara held his gaze, the fire of the bonfire dance still echoing in her bones. She had spent years running from shadows, but here, in this small circle of light with two people who had let her in without question, she found herself whispering, I'm not running anymore. Yet even as the words left her lips, she knew the man outside wasn't finished, and the next knock on the door wouldn't come as politely as the first. The storm arrived before midnight, sheets of rain drumming against the workshop roof, thunder rolling so close it rattled the windows. Mara sat on the edge of the cot, boots laced, unable to sleep. Daniel paced by the door, flashlight in hand, while Lena slept soundly under a quilt in the office chair, trusting her father to keep the night at bay. For a while it was only rain and wind. Then, headlights cut across the soaked gravel, sharp and deliberate. A car door opened. Footsteps crunched closer. This time, there was no polite knock. A fist hammered the steel. Mara, enough running. The voice commanded, loud over the storm. Come outside. You know you owe us. Mara's pulse spiked, but she stood, fists clenched. Daniel pulled the chain tighter across the door and planted himself between her and the noise. She doesn't owe you anything, he said flatly. The reply was a cruel laugh. You think a mechanic can shield her? We built her. She belongs with us. The words hit like shackles, but Mara felt something break inside, an old fear snapping loose. She stepped forward, her voice steady. You didn't build me. You used me, and I don't belong to you. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of metal scraping, someone trying to force the lock. Daniel's hand shot to a crowbar near the bench, muscles tight, ready to fight for the safety of his daughter and the woman who had walked into their lives. Mara touched his arm. This ends tonight, she whispered. Together they braced as the door shuttered. And then, through the storm, another sound rose. More engines, headlights flaring. The volunteers from the night before pulled in, trucks circling like guardians. Doors slammed, voices shouted. The man outside cursed, retreating into the rain, his shadow swallowed by the dark. When the storm finally passed, quiet settled heavy and clean. Mara leaned against the wall, trembling, but not from fear, from release. Daniel set the crowbar aside and looked at her with eyes that held both question and certainty. Are you staying? He asked, voice low. She met his gaze without hesitation. I'm done running. If you'll have me, I stay. For the first time, his guarded expression cracked into something softer, something almost disbelieving. Then stay, he said simply. Days later, the town whispered the story of the stranger who left in the night and never returned. Mara, meanwhile, found herself at the diner counter, laughing with Lena over pie, Daniel sitting nearby with a rare, unguarded smile. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't grand, but it was real. And for Mara, who had once thought success meant skyscrapers and signatures, this was richer than any empire. She had found what power could never buy: trust, belonging, and a home carved not from contracts, but from choice. And when Daniel finally reached across the table, his hand covering hers, Mara knew the truth. The road she thought had ended in failure had only just begun.